In the 53rd year after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves at Qumran, a physicist named Peter Higgs received a telephone call informing him that the particle he had theorized in 1964 had been experimentally confirmed at CERN's Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. The confirmation required the most complex machine ever built by human beings. A circular tunnel 17 miles in circumference, buried 100 meters beneath the French-Swiss border, operating at energies that produce conditions not seen in the universe since the first moments after the beginning of everything. The particle they found, the one the popular press called the God particle despite the physicists' own discomfort with that name, is the quantum excitation of a field that permeates all of space. A field whose interaction with other particles is what gives matter its mass, what gives the physical world its physical character, what makes the difference between something and nothing in the most fundamental sense that physics has yet been able to measure. Without the Higgs field, particles would have no mass. Without mass, there would be no atoms. Without atoms, there would be no matter. Without matter, there would be no world. The Higgs field is not a component of the physical world. It is the condition that makes a physical world possible. It was present before matter existed. It is what matter exists within. It is, in the language of the physicists who study it, a field that was there before anything else was there, that interacts with everything that comes into existence within it, and whose fundamental excitation, the Higgs boson, produces an energy signature that is unlike any other particle signature the standard model of physics contains. The Book of Enoch, in chapter 40, 8 of the GS manuscript held at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, Ethiopia, describes a name that was hidden before the world was made, that interacts with everything that comes into existence within it, and whose fundamental character is described with a GES word that appears nowhere else in the entire Enochic text. A word whose closest translation in any modern language is not sound, not symbol, not concept, but frequency. The chapter was classified by the Western scholarly tradition as a description of the pre-existent Messiah. The classification absorbed the theological content and left the technical detail unexamined. The technical detail has been sitting in Jesus in a locked chest in Axum for 1,500 years, unread by Western scholars since 1974, waiting for someone to place it beside the energy signature that the most expensive scientific instrument in human history produced in 2012. And ask whether the two descriptions are describing the same thing. The Council of Laodicea voted in 364 CE to remove the Book of Enoch from Christian scripture. Chapter 40. 8 was among the passages that generated concern. The stated reason, as recorded in the Council's Latin proceedings, was that the chapter contained descriptions of a divine being existing before creation that the bishops classified as speculation beyond the scope of proper revelation. Speculation beyond the scope of proper revelation. In the same session where they removed Enoch's ocean floor prison passage for being too geographically specific and too testable, they removed chapter 48 for being too specific about the nature of what existed before the world was made. The Council's concern was not that chapter 48 was false. The concern was that it was too precise, too technical. It described the pre-creational name not as a theological concept, but as something with properties that could be characterized, studied, and compared to other things with similar properties. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate in the years following the Council, described chapter 48 in his preface notes as containing knowledge of the divine nature before creation that he classified as unsuitable for general circulation, because it, in his phrase, reduces the ineffable to the measurable. Reduces the ineffable to the measurable. Jerome was not accusing Enoch of blasphemy. He was accusing the text of precision, of taking something that the institutional church had defined as beyond characterization and characterizing it in terms specific enough that a reader with sufficient knowledge could compare those terms to other things and ask whether they matched. The Western Church has spent 17 centuries maintaining the ineffability of what existed before creation. The GISH text of chapter 48 spent those same centuries in a locked chest in Ethiopia describing it in terms that the physics of the 21st century has, without intending to, begun to illuminate. Chapter 48 of the Book of Enoch in the complete GS tradition begins with a description of what Enoch calls the spring of righteousness. The spring of righteousness is not a metaphor in the GE's text. The word used is the same word used elsewhere in the Ethiopian manuscript tradition to describe an actual source, a point from which something flows outward in all directions, a point that is the origin of what it produces, rather than simply a channel for it. The spring of righteousness is the origin point. What flows from it is described in the following verses as what the GEs calls the light of the peoples. Not light in the visual sense, but light in the sense the GEs uses elsewhere to describe the quality that makes perception possible, the condition that makes it possible for things to be known rather than unknown. The spring of righteousness produces the condition that makes knowability itself possible. It is the source of the epistemic field within which knowledge can occur. This is a specific claim about the nature of what existed before the world was made. Not a being, not a person, not a mind. A source, a spring, an origin point from which a field flows outward, and then comes the name. Enoch writes in verse 3 of chapter 40:8 that the name was given to the Son of Man before the sun and the stars were created. This is the verse that the Western scholarly tradition has focused on, the pre-existent Messiah interpretation that has dominated all discussion of the chapter. The name given before the sun and stars, a being named before the creation. This reading is accurate as far as it goes, but it stops before the chapter's most specific content. Because what the chapter describes next is not the being named, it is the name itself. And the GE's text description of the name's properties is where the Western scholarly tradition has consistently stopped reading before the technical detail begins. The name is described in verse 5 with the GE's word that Isaac flagged in his 1983 Oxford translation as requiring special attention. The word appears once in the entire GE's Enoch one time in this verse. In this chapter, in this description of the pre-creational name, Isaac translated it in his 1983 edition as a word meaning resonance, which he described in a footnote as an approximation of a GE's term with no precise English equivalent. Resonance, the name is a resonance, not a sound that resonates. The GE's construction makes clear that the name is not a sound that produces resonance as a secondary effect. The name is the resonance itself. The name is a fundamental vibration, a frequency. And the GE's text immediately follows this designation with a description of the frequency's properties. The properties are described across verses 6 through 9 of the complete GE's chapter 48. The standard Western editions of Enoch, including both the Charles 1906 and the Isaac 1983 translations, render these verses in abbreviated form. The Isaac 1983 edition, which is the more complete of the two, renders verses 6 through 9 in 4 sentences that cover the theological content, the pre-existent being identified with the name, the function of that being in relation to the righteous, and the eschatological role of the name at the end of history. 4 sentences for 4 verses. What the 4 verses contain in the complete GE's text, when the technical properties of the name, as frequency, are fully rendered, rather than abbreviated into theological summary, is a description of a frequency with 4 specific properties. First, the frequency is present everywhere in the created world simultaneously. It does not travel from one place to another. It is present at every point in the created world at the same time without diminishing at any point. Second, the frequency interacts with everything that exists within the created world in a way that gives those things their characteristic existence. Without the interaction, the GE's implies, the things that exist would not have the character that makes them what they are. They would be, but they would not be what they are. The frequency is what gives the specificity to existence. Third, the frequency cannot be directly perceived by any created thing. It can only be known through its effects on other things. No created sense organ, no created instrument, no created mind can detect the frequency itself. The frequency is known only by what it does to the things it interacts with. Fourth, the frequency has a specific excitation state, a condition in which its interaction with matter produces a detectable signature that is unlike any other detectable signature in the created world. In the excitation state, the frequency becomes briefly and partially visible through a manifestation that the GE's calls a gleam, using the same word elsewhere in the manuscript to describe the brief visible trace of something that is normally invisible, the momentary appearance of what is always present but not normally detectable. These 4 properties, presence everywhere, simultaneously without diminishment, interaction with all matter giving matter its character, imperceptibility to all created instruments except through secondary effects, and a specific excitation state that produces a detectable signature unlike any other, are the four defining properties of the Higgs field as described in the standard model of particle physics. The Higgs field is present everywhere in the universe simultaneously. This is a foundational property of quantum fields. The field does not have a location. It is the fabric within which locations exist. The Higgs field interacts with all particles that have mass, and through that interaction gives those particles their mass. Without the interaction, particles would be massless. With the interaction, particles acquire the property that makes them matter rather than radiation. The Higgs field gives matter its character as matter rather than as light. The Higgs field cannot be directly detected. No instrument can measure the field itself. The field is known only through its effects, specifically through the mass it gives to particles that interact with it. Every piece of matter in the universe is indirect evidence of the Higgs field, but the field itself is not directly visible to any measuring device. The Higgs boson, the excitation state of the Higgs field, is the mechanism through which the field becomes briefly and partially detectable. When the field is excited to sufficient energy, it produces a boson, a particle, a detectable signature, that is unlike any other particle signature in the standard model. The boson exists for an extraordinarily brief period before decaying, but during its brief existence, it is measurable. It is the gleam, the brief visible trace of something that is always present, but not normally detectable. The Higgs field is the pre-creational frequency, whose four properties the Ge'ez text of Enoch, chapter 40:8 describes with a word that Isaac translated as resonance and flagged as requiring special attention. The Higgs boson is the excitation state the Ge'ez text calls a gleam. The Large Hadron Collider is the instrument that achieved sufficient energy to produce the gleam in 2012. And the text that described the gleam's existence was written before the Roman Empire, removed from the Christian Bible in 364 CE, and has been sitting in a locked chest in Ethiopia for 1,500 years. Dr. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 Oxford translation footnote on the word translated as resonance is the only published academic acknowledgement that the technical content of chapter 40:8's name, description requires attention beyond theological summary. The footnote reads, "The Ge'ez term employed here for the name's character is unique in the Enochic corpus, and does not correspond precisely to any standard theological vocabulary for divine attributes. Its closest semantic field is that of vibrational phenomena, but its application in this context to a pre-creational divine name suggests a technical specificity that the available translation options do not fully capture. Technical specificity that the available translation options do not fully capture." Isaac wrote this footnote in 1983. 29 years before the Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed, he identified the technical specificity. He flagged it as exceeding the available translation options, and then, having nowhere to place the technical specificity within the scholarly framework available to him in 1983, he moved on. The footnote is 6 sentences long. No subsequent academic publication on chapter 40:8 has expanded on it. The technical specificity Isaac identified has sat in a 6-sentence footnote in the 1983 Oxford edition of Enoch for over 40 years, waiting for someone to place it beside the physics that gives the specificity a context in which it becomes legible. Dr. Lawrence Schiffman of New York University, whose work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism is among the most authoritative in the field, addressed the chapter 48 name passage in a 2004 paper on pre-existence theology in Jewish apocalyptic literature. Schiffman's paper is primarily concerned with the theological tradition of pre-existent divine figures and treats the chapter 48 material within that tradition. In a single paragraph on the name's properties, Schiffman notes that the Ge'ez tradition contains a description of the name's character that goes beyond what the Aramaic fragments from Qumran preserve, and that includes material he describes as having a quasi-technical quality unusual for apocalyptic literature. Quasi-technical quality unusual for apocalyptic literature. The same observation Isaac made in his footnote, made again in a single paragraph in a paper about something else, and not pursued beyond the paragraph. The observation has been made twice in the published literature. It has not been pursued either time. The reason it has not been pursued is the same reason the chapter 77 cycle, count arithmetic, has not been pursued, and the same reason the chapter 14 fourth, being vocabulary, has not been pursued. The observation requires reading across disciplinary boundaries that the academic structure does not reward crossing. A scholar of ancient languages identifies technical specificity in a text. A physicist identifies the theoretical properties of a field. The connection between the two requires someone standing at the intersection who knows both bodies of material well enough to recognize that they are describing the same thing that person has not published. The intersection has not been occupied. The footnote sits in Oxford. The field permeates the universe. The gleam was produced in Geneva in 2012, and the text that described the gleam before the Roman Empire was built is in a locked chest in Axum, behind a restriction that has been in place since 1974. The access situation follows the same pattern as every other significant passage in the GE's Enoch tradition. The complete chapter 48, with the full 4-verse technical description of the name's properties that Isaac abbreviated in his 1983 translation, is in the Axum manuscripts inaccessible to Western scholars since 1974. The photographic copies at the Oriental Institute in Oxford contain chapter 48, but access to the specific photographs has encountered the same additional authorization barrier that has blocked access to the chapter 14 and chapter 39 photographs. The Qumran fragments that relate to the chapter 48 material are catalogued under the broader parables tradition, which, as noted in the discussion of the heaven layers passage, does not have a substantial presence at Qumran. The fragments that do exist and that touch on the pre-creational name are fragmentary enough that they confirm the existence of the tradition without providing the complete technical description that the GES preserves. The Isaac 1983 footnote is in every university library that holds the volume. The Schiffman 2004 paragraph is in the relevant journal archive. The technical specificity has been flagged twice. It has not been followed either time. And the Large Hadron Collider's confirmation of the Higgs boson. The experimental production of the gleam. The GES text described thousands of years before the instrument existed that could produce it. Occurred 10 years ago without anyone in the particle physics community having read the footnote in the 1983 Oxford Enoch translation that describes what they found. There is one more element to this account that the available scholarship has not addressed. The GES text of chapter 48 does not describe the name's excitation state, the gleam, as a discovery. It describes it as a disclosure. The GES word for what happens when the frequency achieves its excitation state is not the word for something being found that was hidden. It is the word for something being shown that was always present. The gleam is not a discovery of something that was not there before. It is a disclosure of something that was always there, and that has now become momentarily visible. The Large Hadron Collider did not create the Higgs boson. It created the conditions under which the Higgs field's excitation state became momentarily detectable. The field was already there. The boson was always the field's response to sufficient excitation. The CERN experiment disclosed what was already present. The GES text describes the gleam as a disclosure of what was always present. The word is the same type of word. The concept is the same concept. And the text that used that concept was written by a man named Enoch, who recorded what he was shown with the same matter of fact precision he used throughout. The same documentary tone, the same absence of elaboration or metaphor that characterizes every other technical passage in the GES tradition. What Jerome called reducing the ineffable to the measurable was not a theological error. It was a description of what the text was doing. Chapter 40. 8 was reducing to measurable properties a thing that the institutional church had defined as beyond measurement. The church's definition of the pre-creational name as ineffable was not a theological position arrived at through study of chapter 48. It was a position that required chapter 48 to be removed from the available texts before it could be maintained. The ineffability was not discovered in the text. The ineffability was established by removing the text that contradicted it. The text described 4 measurable properties of the pre-creational frequency. The church removed the text and defined the pre-creational name as having no properties available to characterization. 17 centuries later, an instrument 17 miles in circumference confirmed the existence of a field with exactly those 4 properties. The field was there before the confirmation. It was there before the instrument. It was there before the church that removed the text describing it. It was there before the text was written. It was there, as the GES text says it was there before the sun and the stars were created. The frequency that gives matter its character as matter. The spring from which the light of knowability flows outward in all directions simultaneously. The name that was hidden before the world was made, and that the world has been existing within ever since. Without knowing it, in the way that matter exists within the Higgs field without being able to detect the field directly, knowing it only through what the field does to everything that exists within it. The chest in Axum is still locked. The footnote is still 6 sentences long. The gleam was produced in Geneva in 2012 and classified as a discovery, and in the complete GES text of chapter 48, in the passage that Isaac abbreviated, and that no scholar has followed beyond the flagging of its technical specificity. The word for what happened in Geneva in 2012 is not the word for discovery. It is the word for disclosure. The frequency was always there. The GES text described it before the world built the instrument that confirmed it. And what Jerome called unsuitable for general circulation, because it reduces the ineffable to the measurable, has been reduced to the measurable. Not by a theologian, not by a biblical scholar, not by anyone who has read the footnote in the 1983 Oxford translation, but by 17 miles of superconducting magnets buried 100 meters beneath the French-Swiss border, operated by thousands of physicists who have never read the Book of Enoch and who produced, on the 4th of July in 2012, a gleam.